Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 63 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We said a little while ago we were going to kind of shift a little bit of the focus of the show more towards open source. We wanted to kind of get away from, kind of being vendor-centric, proprietary-centric. So we've been talking more and more to people that are in the open source space. And tonight we're kind of going back to explore a topic that we've talked about a couple of times, but it's been like 6 months. So we're glad to have on James Waters, Director of Cloud Foundry Ecosystem and Business Development from VMware. So James, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Aaron's not on tonight. Aaron's off doing dad stuff. And we were also going to have Andy Piper, who does developer advocacy. But we're doing this at a time when, unfortunately, Andy had to drop off last minute. So we may talk about some stuff for the rest of the world, but I'll sort of make some notes about Andy because he's doing a really, really good job with the VMware, the Cloud Foundry community, sort of in the rest of the world. So, he may join on later on in the show, but we'll kind of get started. So let's talk about Cloud Foundry. We had Dave on a couple of times in the past. Dave's since moved on to do some cool stuff.
Let's be honest, Dave's moved on to be a Cloud Foundry customer, so yeah, exactly. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so he's off doing cool stuff with Warner Music.
Yep.
So that's very, very cool. So let's talk a little bit about Cloud Foundry, because when Dave and I were talking about it, we were talking like real kind of generic PaaS, like just trying to understand like how's PaaS different. We were talking about frameworks and what are developers like, but let's sort of talk about it from a VMware perspective, because we never really have explored that. We were joking before the show. I said, I'm not sure if you're the most loved guy at VMware or the most hated guy at VMware, and I was joking because VMware traditionally is a company that sells products. It's not an open source company, and a lot of what they do is things that are building on top of their hypervisor legacy. And Cloud Foundry comes along, and it's got the potential to be this huge disruptor to the marketplace in terms of new opportunities to get in the application space. But it's open source, so new business models, new revenue streams, and it's kind of platform independent, right? I mean, that's the PaaS thing. So what's VMware's take on Cloud Foundry? I mean, like, what's kind of the marching orders that you have, and then what does the community think of VMware being behind Cloud Foundry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'd say is that developers are cool at VMware and apps are cool at VMware. And those two things are definitely a big area of focus for a lot of the executives there. And the number one order of Cloud Foundry was go be a tool that every developer wants to use. And that's why we're open source, and that's why we're multi-platform, because developers don't adopt technologies, different development stacks, just based on where they're going to deploy something. You're going to need to be ubiquitous. So, Microsoft kind of had a vision of where your development stack, your deployment stack, all of your tooling all came from them, and that they would be the single source solution. And you can see what happened to them is that they've had to pivot pretty hard, and on their data services, they've, rumored to spending, a king's ransom, getting Hortonworks to port Hadoop to Windows and to Azure. They worked with Joyent to port Node.js to Azure. So they're actually having to really change that whole model to port those open source applications to their proprietary stack. And we've taken the opposite approach, which is to go find the most popular open source communities and bring them under an umbrella of one open source platform as a service that has the best already baked in. And go after it that way. So it's really more around a developer-focused and app-centric view of the world. And I think that's become very important to VMware, because at the end of the day, the container only links to service the app.
Yep, exactly. Now, when Cloud Foundry got started, Paul Moritz was still running the company. Some of the folks that were involved with it early on, some of Paul's management team had come from Microsoft. Do you think those guys sort of learned their lessons from some of that, from having been at Microsoft, and kind of how development tools and developers are treated, or do you think it was more a matter of just where we are today? Open source is really prevalent with how the web's built, how the cloud's built. How much of it was sort of lessons learned versus just the times that we live in today?
Well, I'd risk a joke here, and I'd say that at least some of them went through a Google car wash first.
True.
So, directly, the three guys that came over, Mark, came from Microsoft originally, but he spent several years at Google in the meantime, doing a lot of web technology there. So I think he had a really good pulse for what web developers wanted and how to build a web architecture product first. So I do think that there was some ex-Microsoft in it, but I think they were actually more interested in some of the Google DNA that they'd inherited there, and kind of from starting from web architecture, what is the future first? And a lot of the thinking that goes into capturing next generation platforms is, you look at, MapReduce started at Google, worked its way out to Yahoo, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to catch those early trends that are coming out of these massive web scale folks is, I think, part of the strategy.
Yeah, understood. So,
and I'm always amazed, by the way, Brian, that tends to be predictable. Like I always wait for something to fail and for it to not get adopted. But sometimes these really big, highly demanding architectures are a pretty good predictor of the future.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, we always, back in the day when I was working at Cisco and we were doing kind of new networking types of technologies, we always sort of said, look, if it works in New York City, and even though it was always really big scale, and if it worked in New York City and it worked in the financial trading floors, you sort of knew it would work in the rest of the world. It was just a matter of kind of how do you get people to sort of scale it down or learn to adopt it. But once that technology gets hardened in some of the really difficult places, you're right, it does tend to spread very quickly. So let's talk about those developers. So one of the conversations that happens around PaaS, and it comes from different vendors, but it also comes from folks who are kind of in the middle of this, is this idea that there's kind of a Silicon Valley view of PaaS, and then there's the rest of the world view of what's going on with that. And this is one of the things we said we sort of wished Andy was on the call, but you guys took for most of the year now, you've taken Cloud Foundry sort of on the road, a ton of cities around the world. What sort of feedback do you get from around the world outside of Silicon Valley about PaaS, just PaaS in general, but more importantly, kind of about Cloud Foundry? What's the community outside of Silicon Valley saying about this, or adoption about this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of answers here. The first is, I haven't been in every world tour event the same way Andy has. So, I won't speak for the coffee shop conversation in Bangalore about Cloud Foundry. I missed it. But what I do watch is every tweet that comes out around Cloud Foundry, around our ecosystem partners like AppFog and others. And I'm always amazed to find, say, a developer. One of my favorites to follow was a developer working in Egypt using AppFog to build new apps for Egypt. And I thought, PaaS has some legs here, because here's someone who can very quickly get an app going and just focus on his app amidst the chaos and relative disorder that was going on in his country at the time. And I felt actually pretty good about that.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a whole new generation of developers that are going to be able to grow up and write useful applications for the world without having to understand some of the underlying infrastructure in as much detail as the previous generation.
Right.
So I think that's a fairly ubiquitous demand from all kinds of developers of that level that, really demand simplicity from a platform service. The other thing I'd mention that's notable from our geographic coverage is that China has just been unbelievably popular for us. We had over 2,000 people come to our open tour, their event there in China. And I think, they're very ravenous for the latest and greatest open source development technologies that they can build their economy on. And the Cloud Foundry has been incredibly popular there. And there's often news coming out of China that people don't hear about as much in the States because it's fairly firewalled off, if you will. But our adoption there has been very strong.
Yeah. Have you seen anybody, any good stories, any good sort of anecdotes of people who really quickly have been able to take Cloud Foundry and do something that's kind of meaningful in their country, but we might look at it as being like, I wouldn't have thought about it because it wasn't as big. Just sort of that. I built an app. I did this cool thing for my village, for my country, for my school. I mean, have there been any kind of neat very quick and dirty things that have come out that you go, man, that would have taken me 18 months with other types of frameworks?
I don't have the Kodak moment in mind for you. That Egyptian story is my favorite, but I literally do see very strong geographic coverage. Obviously, Brazil's big too. I just got called by 4 people in Brazil who are building apps very rapidly with Cloud Foundry. So I can't think of like the marquee app that like brought mothers and lost children together in Uganda or something. But I've seen a lot of geographic adoption, multi-geographic adoption of Cloud Foundry. Because like you say, it is so useful to them. They don't have to worry about so many things. They can move faster.
Yeah.
And in the United States, we often have the luxury. I mean, the kind of customers that exist here of employing huge teams of people to do small things. And I actually think that's one of the things that PaaS will change over time, but that's a luxury. And in other countries, they don't always have, giant IT teams to go work on new apps. And I think that's why sometimes you can see adoption happening faster there.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing I find with open source is, because you don't necessarily have to go get a lot of things, and Cloud Foundry's done some very cool stuff between micro Cloud Foundry, so I can just build it on my laptop. I can take it with me. I can do whatever. I mean, there's a very good chance there's a lot of people developing those applications that right now are probably just sitting on their laptop somewhere. And as the cloud provider ecosystem starts to grow, right now it's, there's some very strong ones here in the U.S. Over time, there will be globally. I think we'll probably start to see more and more of those kind of pop up. And, if the technology works the way it should, that guy should just be able to go, I built this, it runs on my micro cloud. I should just be able to push that anywhere. I could push it out to, cloudfoundry.org, but I could also push it to tier 3 or provider in China or Brazil or wherever. So I would guess we'll start to see that more and more early parts of next year, I would think.
Yeah, I think the other thing that it's cool is that AppFog has gotten pretty famous amongst a certain group of people. They've hit 100,000 applications deployed, and they're based pretty much entirely on Cloud Foundry, and so there's a little bit of AppFog envy out there starting amongst service providers.
Okay.
And at one conference I was at, they came up to me and they're like, we saw these AppFog demos. Can you just make us into AppFog? We want to be just like AppFog. And, you can't replace the team at AppFog. And there's certainly, there's a lot of things you can't just have for free. But the nice answer is that technologically, you can play in that ecosystem pretty quickly with Cloud Foundry, and you can be compatible. And that was actually a provider that had flown the whole way to our conference from South Africa to talk to me about this, and I couldn't believe that because that's a pretty big flight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and AppFog's the one that's doing kind of a cool, different business model, right? Everything is memory based for them. If I'm remembering right, they came out and said, "Hey, we're not going to do VM based pricing or whatever. It's all going to be memory based pricing." Is that? I think.
Yeah, and you can put as many apps as you want in a free slice of memory, and they have, I believe, 6 different locations that you can manage with one console. So if you compare it to existing platforms and services on the market, where you typically get one location and that's it. They've taken a pretty radical step. And what's interesting about that is that's exactly what you should do when new open source comes out. You should take the best from that open source and then build value above and around it,
right.
That wasn't there before. So instead of having to build the application lifecycle stack, they had that with Cloud Foundry, and now they're doing multi-data center and a slick console to manage it all.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, one of the things that was sort of, it's been interesting. I mean, you guys have taken a very what people call polyglot, or multiple developer framework. So it's Ruby and PHP and Java and Node, and so sort of all the languages. But it feels like, and I don't, tell me if this is true or if it's just what we sort of see from the outside. It feels like a lot of those languages are being driven not just by VMware. It wasn't just with Spring, but I mean, like, you're seeing the different people in the community take ownership of that, of Node, of something else. It feels like they're really driving it in a lot of cases. Is that true? Is that what's really happening in the community?
We have a formal program called Community Leads. So for Python and for PHP, the contributions and frankly the forum support comes from those companies that are the community leads. So AppFog is a PHP focused company. They were and they still are, and they have a lot of PHP developers. So they contribute that expertise that we don't have on staff on our team. And ActiveState is actually one of the largest language support companies in the world, just from providing support for bare languages like Python and Perl. and Tickle, and they are the community lead for Python. So that is definitely part of the model, and I think that's the great thing about open source is developer can have a common tool set and a common tool chain without having to change that, and then get the expertise that they need from different parts of the community for certain apps, for certain languages. And it's not a breaking migration. So you don't have to say, I have to drop my whole way of thinking about apps to change languages.
Okay. So, as you guys are adding more languages, there's been a lot of announcements over the last, say, 6 months about new database technologies, whether it's like Mongo or Cassandra or whatever. As you're driving business development, I mean, you're out there talking to people, whether they're technology partners or other people. Like, how much do you get involved with when people come to you and say, can you give us more attention in this space? Can you give us more? I mean, are you involved with that? Who's involved with trying to make sure that there's enough technology there to do a lot of cool things, but more so like, trying to marry, maybe there are cool business opportunities. Is that where you're involved, or who drives those sort of things?
Yeah, so I look at all the new database technologies that are out there for sure. I know most of those companies and their management staff pretty well. Mongo's the one really external partnership that we have with 10gen, where it's not just like with MySQL, we have no relationship with Oracle per se. We just use the community version of MySQL. We've done some close work with 10gen, and we're pretty excited about their developer community as well. They've got a lot of users. They can throw up a conference anywhere in the country and get 300 or 400 people there, and there's not a lot of technologies that can do that. So I definitely am involved in that. And the other side of that, though, is that we came out with Cloud Foundry Core, which I believe we're going to talk about, which is a way of saying, look, there's a lot of great technologies in the world, and we want to be a polyglot PaaS that supports as many of those as possible in our open source. But let's specify what every provider we think should have as a baseline. And the baseline is just as important as the long tail in some way, because that means if you write to that baseline, you can move it anywhere you want. And so 10gen and MongoDB is included in that core specification. I think that was an interesting decision that we made to include a next generation database like that in what is a very tight and supposedly more narrow scope than the rest of the project. So there's definitely two tensions there. One is serve the long tail, and the other is do a couple of things really, really well and make that portable.
Gotcha. So let's talk about Cloud Foundry Core. It got announced this week. I had pinged you, a couple of weeks ago and said, hey, James, is there kind of an official list of providers that people could go to if they wanted to deploy?
That's right, you did. I said, hey, hold on.
You said, hold on a couple of weeks. I assume this was kind of what it was. So talk about what Core is. I mean, what's it trying to signal to the market? What does it help for providers to sort of leverage the Cloud Foundry name? What's it ultimately trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, for us, again, it all comes back to serving application developers well with tools that help them. And one of my favorite things about Core is that it's not a logo program per se, or a static content management CMS that just lists a bunch of people where everyone throws a logo in and there's really no ongoing responsibility that's hard to maintain. With Cloud Foundry, with core.cloudfoundry.org, you can go out in real time and query and test what applications and services any one of our any Cloud Foundry endpoint has, and we'll also preemptively list for you people who have a good history of following Core as it goes along. So it'll be an evolving specification that you can understand that they'll have that on an ongoing basis. So I think Core is really important because a lot of the conversation in cloud has been around APIs and compatibility and a lot of these far-flung things and open cloud, but no one has ever said, look, let's start with the app, be app focused. What does the app need to run? Let's make sure that's in these, I think right now we have 16 clouds listed in Cloud Foundry Core, 16 locations. So we've come and said, if you write to the specification Cloud Foundry Core, you can now host your app guaranteed in those 16 locations. And I think that's a unique promise that almost no other cloud software out there is making today. I think the closest thing you have is running in an Amazon availability zones and regions, but there you have to maintain your whole app and do a lot of the work yourself. You don't get any of the benefits of PaaS.
I gotcha. So it doesn't preclude anybody today from just taking any of the Cloud Foundry code and doing whatever they want with it. But if you've evolved to that point where you want to deploy it on somebody else's cloud. You want to know that, I may deploy some amount of the services on AppFog, some on tier 3, some on Aruhu, or I want to have mobility. It kind of gives you a sense of, okay, that's my baseline, and then you can sort of build from there. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, that's right. That's what you can write to, and it'll be on cloudfoundry.com, it'll be in microcloud, and it'll be in the partners that have signed up to be core compatible. You can get that anywhere you want. If you need to break out of that and go with something special to any one of those providers, that's your choice. But we wanted to offer a baseline and a cadence that, those providers will be going along with us as we evolve the spec forward. So when we need to update to a new version of a database, we can do that more gracefully together, and there'll be, true application portability.
Okay.
And we also want to provide real-time tools so that developers can validate those promises that other people are making versus, having them be implicit, saying, oh, well, we're all part of this open cloud group, and therefore you might get application portability. We want to provide a tool that really checks for it.
Right. Now, obviously, when we start talking about sort of app portability, it's one thing to talk about the providers that do it. At some point, somebody's going to say, well, hey, what about me as an enterprise? Maybe what if I want to run it inside my walls? And I know one of the things that Pat Gelsinger mentioned at VMworld in one of his keynotes, and it didn't get a whole lot of press. It was sort of a one-liner, but he said, hey, sometime in 2013, we're going to have a sort of an enterprise, behind the firewall version of Cloud Foundry that you'll be able to get at. Do you spend much of your time? Do you hear much yet from enterprise customers, or is it still kind of early and they're going, hey, we'd like to think about it, keep us in the loop? Or, how much of your time do you ever spend with that type of customer set?
A lot.
Okay.
There's a lot of enterprise customers working with the open source. And it's truly one of the unique gifts of Cloud Foundry is that you can have your own.
Okay.
The two most public ones, we oftentimes enterprise customers, unlike, grassroots developers, don't like talking about what they're doing.
Right.
So you don't see a lot of tweets on Twitter from big company installing and using Cloud Foundry, but they exist. The two biggest ones that are public references are Intel and Warner Music, both of which started to hire teams around it. I mean, that's where Dave went. He was on the Cloudcast before. He went to Warner Music, and he's obviously working on Cloud Foundry there. That's why they recruited him.
Right.
So I actually think that the promise there is giant. And the one thing I'd offer is that it's not just a technology for these folks. It's also organizational change. They say, now that we're adopting PaaS, what else could we change about the way we think of all of this? And it's caused a lot of introspection in enterprises. One enterprise, mentioned publicly that, we have a head of compiling Apache on our application team. So they have someone that just does that. And it can take, maybe 6 months from the time an app developer has an idea, wants to start working on something, to when it can be in production, often more. And that is a huge opportunity. It's one thing to get startups going fast. It's another to change the apps that power the economy and how quickly they can evolve. And the fun confluence of events here is that mobilization is coming along and causing a lot of people to write a lot of new apps at the same time PaaS is coming. So that's where you see a very strong thread of interest, is when you have a lot of new apps coming online for mobile, and they need to be written in a 3 to 6 month or less time frame. It's not the same deployment philosophy as it used to be when you're writing an ERP application that might have an 18-month consulting cycle to really roll out and deploy.
Right. Yeah, and that's
the world of Oracle process apps like we used to live in.
Right. No, and that's a very cool kind of set of things coming together, and because of the fact that you can make them mobile. I mean, you literally can have your development team go out, develop it on one of the public services, and if for some reason you want to bring it back in house at some point, you'll have that capability. And then long term, if you're developing other apps, you can sort of do that, as like you said, as your organization evolves to know how to deal with moving things that quickly. So very cool. So that's sort of probably a 2013 thing. I suspect there's a bunch of packaging that'll be involved with that. Plus, there will probably be a very, very ripe market for people that have been doing Cloud Foundry operations behind the scenes to do a bunch of consulting work for those types of companies.
A consulting company, Cloud TP, wrote a rant yesterday or last week. Did you see that?
No, I didn't see it.
They wrote a rant and they said, commercialize Cloud Foundry now. And, without answering every point by point, he was saying, basically, all of my customers are ready for this. They're just waiting for VMware to say go and have it available as a product, and it's going to be a huge market. So that's the kind of thing that keeps a new technology guy like me kind of up at night, excited, and working the late hours.
Yeah, no, that's very cool, and that's that's the other side of the conversation. I think that people kind of have to think about when because a lot of times traditional people, like people who have kind of grown up in environments where the product is driving the revenue stream. Open source, while there are parts of it that are free. I mean, it doesn't mean that every part of it comes for free. I mean, there's revenue opportunities, there's technology learning opportunities. I mean, it's just a different sort of focus on where things go. So, for folks that listen to this and you're hearing these things, like what James is doing is unlocking a whole bunch of different types of opportunities that you can evolve to, that your career can evolve to. So that's very, very cool.
If you have Cloud Foundry skills, deployment management skills today, you can name your price. So all these enterprises that are spinning up and starting to use Cloud Foundry, if you can come in as an expert to them, name your price. Trust me.
Yeah, and since you guys offer sort of the free version of it, you can go out on cloudfoundry.org. Folks can play with this all day long if they really wanted to. So, yep. Very cool. So I guess sort of last question. We'll wrap this up. So as you're talking to people, especially as you're talking to developers, whether they're enterprise developers or the guys who are running this as a service, you talked a little bit ago about like this is a change. Forget about the technology, but this is a change of how they operate things, how much visibility they have as to what's going on. I mean, what do you hear from those guys in terms of how comfortable they feel with it today? Like how much more visibility do they wish they have? Are they getting used to it? I mean, what's the general kind of feedback, or what are the big feedbacks that you get about PaaS and specifically about Cloud Foundry?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things I'll mention that any PaaS is going to go through is like, how do you scale data for an app that's gone very large? How do you do very large scale data in a PaaS?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that it would be great to get rid of is the idea that if you're in a PaaS, you get to a certain scale and you just can't run it there anymore. I think that's a thread, and it talks to people that are thinking of building Cloud Foundry services for high scale apps, and that's pretty exciting.
Now why would that?
With the flexibility.
I mean, given like you said, that I mean, a lot of that's going to be sort of the underlying database technology. Why would there be this concern about it not being able to scale?
It's more just from the constraints of the typical deployment that the PaaS is built to handle. And so a lot of things have been very Chinese menu based, and here's your 4 options for database, and if you don't fit into that model, then you're broken. Okay. But think of the things we could do with outside collaborators, adding additional configuration options in open source for people that are very expert in databases, just like we did with runtimes. Imagine they could say, hey, here's like a high scale configuration for this that really works well. Let's contribute that to open source. I mean, we're not there yet, but I think we're going to have a lot of surface area around databases and data configuration that we'll be able to go after and attack that other more purely menu-based platforms that aren't open source can't go after. Okay. And I think that's pretty exciting. I think that's, PaaS has certainly met the simplicity market. It is growing very fast there, and I'm looking forward to it breaking out into some more interesting spaces as well.
Okay. And like when you hear those sort of things, does that sort of set off a red flag or an alarm for you that says, I've got to go kind of drive that. I've got to bring those problems to the MongoDBs, the Bashos, the Cassandras of the world, or are they kind of aware of it and they work with, I mean, like how do those kind of concerns kind of then get propagated to the community?
I mean, I talk to 10gen every week, so okay. We're definitely in close collaboration with 10gen. And I think you may see some things come out in the future. Those are long lead items to automate and scale databases, but there's certainly some interesting things that I think could come out of our 10gen relationship. And the other ones, we don't currently have in Cloud Foundry, but we may in the future always keep them in mind. React and Cassandra are both good at multi-data center configurations. That we don't currently have. That could be interesting. I mean, part of it, the whole magic of it, I think, is navigating where you can find current demand to keep growing the project and to keep people excited about it without overreaching too far, while at the same time really tackling hard problems and solving hard problems. So, in a tweet a couple weeks ago, I said the fine balance between NIH, not invented here, and not refusing to solve hard problems, and that's what's always interesting with new tech, is looking at those.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last thing, and I'll let you go. So we're kind of getting to that time of year where everybody's looking forward to the next year, kind of setting goals, making predictions. As you're sitting there, Cloud Foundry's officially roughly a year and a half old or so. As you're looking at 2013, like what do you set for goals? What'll tell you that it's going good or it's going great, or you feel like, okay, we've covered, like we've gotten over that next hurdle? What are going to be those things that you're looking for Cloud Foundry to sort of say, hey, this is going to be successful, or the things that you'll feel really good about?
Yeah, I'm the ecosystem development guy. So for me, it's growth of the ecosystem and signs of life there. So in the last 2 months, several Cloud Foundry specific consultancies have popped up. And this is when I said you can name your price. That's happening because you can name your price.
Okay. What are some of those names? Who are some of those people?
Yeah, Cloud Elements is one of them. They're based in Colorado, and I think we're doing a video with them, not to break any secrets.
Sure.
We'll be talking more about them in the future. They're out there. They love Cloud Foundry. They're building apps just for Cloud Foundry. They're installing Cloud Foundries for people. That's coming. And then I know of some other ones that are being created right now that aren't publicly launched, where people are saying, hey, I can go build a business on Cloud Foundry. Service providers coming to me and saying, I want to have a Cloud Foundry business. And that's all driven off a virtuous cycle of more developers being aware of us at the low end, and then also more enterprises with custom configurations wanting to engage and start building things out. I would say over the next couple months, I've watched the growth of that as an ecosystem guy with a little bit of happiness, and it continues to evolve. And then I think it'll get to more of a tipping point. Hopefully we can push as hard as we can in the next year to get that going.
Very cool. Well, listen, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up then. So we're out of time for the week, James. So thank you so much for taking the time, for being on the show. For folks that maybe don't follow you on Twitter, or want to know more about Cloud Foundry and PaaS, where's the best place to kind of keep up with what's going on with Cloud Foundry in the PaaS space, events and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think our Cloud Foundry blog is actually pretty prolific. Well, there's a lot coming out there. That's great to watch. So I believe that's still at blog.cloudfoundry.com, unless it's /blog. I don't quite remember. Okay. Maybe it's /blog.
Yep.
And that's a great place to check out. And then, I'd also say there's a bunch of the Cloud Foundry folks who do hang out on Twitter. Andy, myself, are pretty prolific. Patrick Chen is on. Anytime you have a question, I, for one, watch everything that gets said about Cloud Foundry anywhere on the internet. So I'll try to answer back pretty quickly. So check those two things out. And if you ever need to just ask a question, we're always here waiting.
Very cool. Well, again, thank you so much for the time, folks. We're out of time for the show. If you like the show, leave us a review on iTunes. You can always follow us on Twitter at the Cloudcast.net, or any of the social media links that you can find off of the Cloudcast.net website. So for James and for Aaron, who's off today, thanks and have a good weekend.